Dr. Sarah Collins wiped sweat from her brow, squinting against the harsh desert sun. After years of searching, her team had finally located the lost tomb of Amun-Ra, a little-known pharaoh from Egypt's 18th dynasty. As she descended into the newly excavated entrance, Sarah's excitement was tinged with unease. The hieroglyphs they'd uncovered spoke of a terrible curse protecting the pharaoh's rest. "Nonsense," she muttered, shaking off her superstition. This was the find of a lifetime. The beam of her headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in intricate paintings and carvings. Sarah's breath caught as she entered the main chamber. In the center stood a massive sarcophagus, its gold surface gleaming as if brand new. "It's incredible," whispered her assistant Tom, stepping up beside her. "Completely untouched for over 3,000 years." As they approached the sarcophagus, Sarah's foot caught on something. She looked down to see a small figurine carved from obsidian. Its jackal head seemed to grin up at her. "Odd," she murmured, pocketing the artifact for later study. The team worked tirelessly through the night, cataloguing the tomb's treasures. As dawn approached, Sarah prepared to open the sarcophagus. Her hands trembled with anticipation as she and Tom carefully lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay the mummified remains of Amun-Ra, surrounded by priceless jewelry and sacred objects. But something was wrong. The corpse's withered hands were not crossed over its chest as was customary, but splayed out as if clawing at the lid. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She shook it off, focusing on the task at hand. This was a momentous discovery, not the time for wild imaginings. As the sun rose outside, the team began transporting artifacts to their camp for analysis. Sarah was the last to leave, taking a final look around the tomb. As she turned to go, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She whirled around, heart pounding. Nothing, just shadows cast by her lamp. That night, Sarah tossed and turned in her tent, unable to shake a feeling of dread. In her dreams, she saw the mummy's hands reaching for her, heard whispers in a language long dead. She awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. Outside, the wind howled across the dunes. Sarah fumbled for her watch. 3 a.m., the darkest part of the night. A scream pierced the air, abruptly cut short. Sarah bolted upright, rushing outside. The camp was in chaos. Tents flapped in the wind, equipment scattered across the sand. Of her team, there was no sign. "Tom," she called. "Anybody?" Only the wind answered. Heart racing, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and headed for the tomb. As she approached the entrance, she saw dark stains on the sand. Blood. She hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she had to know what happened to her team. Steeling herself, Sarah entered the tomb. The beam of her flashlight danced across the walls. The beautiful paintings from yesterday were changed, depicting scenes of torture and death. At the center of each mural was a dark figure with a jackal's head. Sarah's hand went to her pocket, feeling for the obsidian figurine. It was gone. A low moan echoed through the chamber. Sarah spun around, the beam of her light landing on a huddled figure. "Tom?" she whispered. Her assistant looked up, his face pale and drawn. "Sarah," he croaked. "Run! It's awake! The curse!" Before he could finish, a mass of bandages exploded from the shadows, wrapping around Tom's legs. He screamed as he was dragged into darkness. Sarah ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear something behind her, the slap of bare feet on stone. At the tomb's entrance, she risked a glance back. The mummy of Amun-Ra stood in the doorway, its desiccated face twisted in a snarl. But it wasn't alone. Dark shapes gathered around it, the missing members of her team, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. Sarah fled across the sand, the voices of the damned howling behind her. She reached the camp, scrambling for the satellite phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed for help. No signal. A cold hand gripped her shoulder. Sarah screamed, whirling around to face her attacker. Tom stood there, his skin grey and papery, eyes blank and lifeless. "The Pharaoh awakens," he intoned in a voice not his own. "The curse is fulfilled." Sarah broke free, running blindly into the desert. The wind whipped sand into her eyes as behind her, inhuman shrieks split the night. She ran until her lungs burned, until the camp disappeared behind dunes. Finally, she collapsed, gasping for air. The desert was silent save for the wind. Had she escaped? As if in answer, the sand beneath her began to shift. Skeletal hands burst from the ground, clawing at her legs. Sarah screamed as she was dragged down into suffocating darkness. She awoke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in her tent. Pale dawn light filtered through the canvas. Sarah's heart raced as she looked around. Everything seemed normal. "Just a nightmare," she muttered, running a shaking hand through her hair. She stepped outside. The camp was stirring, her team preparing for another day of excavation. "Morning, Dr. Collins," Tom called cheerfully. "Ready to open that sarcophagus today?" Sarah stared at him, a chill running down her spine. Hadn't they already? She shook her head, trying to clear it. "Of course," she said. "Let's get started." As they walked to the tomb, Sarah's hand brushed her pocket. Her fingers closed around a small, cold object. She pulled it out, her blood turning to ice. The obsidian jackal grinned up at her, its eyes gleaming in the morning sun. In the distance, the wind howled across the dunes, carrying with it the echoes of ancient, terrible laughter.